Welcome, everybody, as we're letting you into the room. Apologies for being a couple of minutes late. It's lovely technology issues with having people attending from all around the world. I'm Mel Willer, Senior Manager of Education for the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, as well as the Chartered Institute of Housing Canada. And I'm happy to pass this over to Ray Sullivan to host this fun webinar today. So I'm going to pass it over to Ray, and I'm excited to be here in the background for anything that anybody needs.
Thank you very much, Mel. And Mel is the Senior Manager of Education at CHRA and the Chartered Institute of Housing Canada, and is quickly becoming the international face of housing for Canadians around the world. I really want to thank them for putting this panel together with some fantastic guests. And in the past couple of years, the Chartered Institute of Housing Canada and CHRA have been really trying to reach out to housers in other parts of the world to see what we can learn and what we can bring back into our own practice here in Canada. And in fact, just last week, we opened registration for our third international study tour, and we'll be going to Copenhagen, Denmark at the end of September. We've got 30 spots, and I think 2/3 of them are already full just 1 week in. So if folks are interested in learning from folks and our colleagues internationally, please do join us there. We've got a great panel ahead of us today. Thank you all very much for joining us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce people one at a time, and I have a couple of introductory questions for each of you. So 2 questions. One, who's in charge where you do your work? In Canada, we have a federal system. There are 3, 4, sometimes 5 different orders of government, depending on where people live. In different provinces, there are different authorities. The federal government has been, in the past 8 years, trying to step into this space more. There are jurisdictional issues all over the place. So I'm really curious, in the countries where you operate, who has the lead from a government perspective on non-market community and social housing? And then the second question, it's a long-standing rallying cry for us at CHRA that we need to more than double the share of community housing in Canada. So we're only about 4% of all housing stock that is non-market community housing in Canada. We have been a higher share in the past. We peaked sometime in the mid-90s, and we've actually not made progress since then. So what is the rough general share of non-market social housing where you operate amongst the whole housing stock? So we're going to start with Paul. Welcome, Paul. Paul Tennant is a member of the Chartered Institute in the United Kingdom. He's also one of the founders and is still active in the Chartered Institute of Housing Canada and the International Housing Partnership. And Paul spent a lot of his career at Orbit Realty, was one of the voices who came over to Canada decades ago, helped inspire us to aim for bigger scale in what we're doing. He's now the CEO of Abbeyfield Living Society, which operates in 9 countries, including Canada. I think you've got housing in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and BC. And in 2015 was named an Order of the British Empire, an officer of the British Empire. And we're very, very happy that Paul is joining us. So Paul, who's in charge and what's the market share where you operate?
Who's in charge is government, because it's a Labour government, and that will become apparent as we talk about numbers later. The Labour government is in charge, and it's made a very strong commitment towards the housing agenda as one of its priorities. So therefore, we now have financial support coming into the sector, probably classed as a transformational amount of money in the last budget, and that is intended to create 1.5 million homes over the time of the Parliament. The government has made that really powerful commitment. It's up to the sector to deliver. Beyond that, we work through Homes England. Homes England is the investment arm, a quango within the government, and it places the funding, 39 billion, which will be distributed through bids that will go in from organisations over the next 5 years. Homes England's been around in 5 or 6 different iterations in the time I've been in the housing sector. Now it's got a broad brief. It's very similar to Build Canada Homes in terms of its role and its remit, probably slightly larger because it covers regeneration as well. And then I suppose the reality for me is it's my board are in charge. So therefore it's how we use and bid for those resources that were the key thing going forward. But very much driven by the government, it is a major priority for them. And that's been really advantageous to us because that's put housing front and centre in a government target. Therefore, they need us to try and deliver this. But to the massive shift from where we were over the last few years, suddenly government put a target together and we are there to support them to deliver that. So that's really helped our cause. In terms of the size of the sector, private rented homes, probably 65% of the market in the UK. Build to let 9% and shared ownership is about 1% of the market. Private rent is about 19% of the market, for about 5.5 million homes. And the non-market, social housing, affordable and the like, that's around about 19%, 4.5 million social housing homes. But only probably 3.8 of those are social rent. We differentiate between social rent and affordable. Affordable rent is 80% of market. So social rent, for those who do really need support, it has reduced in number over the last few years, but this investment is very much about trying to bring that back into play and drive the provision, because simply it's a supply and demand issue. Demand is huge, supply is low. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the market, but also where social housing sits within that.
Paul, I definitely want to come back later on in the conversation about the parallels between Homes England and Build Canada Homes, the new entity that's launching here. Next, we'll go to Justin. Justin Cartwright is a national director of the Chartered Institute of Housing in Northern Ireland. He has worked for more than a decade in housing and has a Bachelor of Applied Science from the University of Melbourne. So I've not yet met Justin before. I'm really interested to find out what that accent sounds like, hearing that part of your bio. So over to you, Justin. What level of government is in charge, and what is the market share of community housing?
Yeah, so who's in charge? It's a bit odd. There are parallels with the way kind of federal government is set up in Canada and similar countries, but Northern Ireland, which is the area I cover, is kind of a constituent country of the UK. So you kind of say that the UK is often referred to as a country of countries. So you would have certain policies that would be retained by the UK government in Westminster, and then everything that isn't retained is devolved to Northern Ireland areas like, health, education, housing, the kind of things that ordinarily would, be covered at a state level or perhaps a provincial level. The way we work it is that basically any differential in the amount of money that UK government spends, there's a complicated thing called the Barnett calculations. So basically it goes in a sausage machine, and whatever comes out, then we get what's called the block grant, which is an amount of money that the Northern Ireland executive has to spend on stuff. And then it's up to them to determine what their strategic priorities are, what money gets allocated where. So to answer your question in terms of who's in charge, it's the Northern Ireland executive is ultimately in charge of policy. And then we have a permanent, like the rest of the UK, a permanent civil service that, delivers those strategies and approaches on their behalf. In terms of what housing looks like in Northern Ireland, it's traditional. It's also quite distinct. So social housing makes up around 15-16% of the overall housing stock, which I understand, to Canadian ears is very high, similar to Australia. My home state of Victoria, social housing when I left only made up about 4.5%. So I think the market in Australia is quite similar to Canada in some ways. Whereas here, like the rest of the UK, public housing, social housing has had a very long history and is part of, I guess, the social fabric of the place. What's unique about it is that we have a single central housing authority, one public landlord called the Northern Ireland Housing Executive that has around 83,000 homes. So all the homes that you normally find local council ownership in the rest of the UK, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive does it all. Interestingly, it doesn't build new social housing anymore through the what they call the mixed funding regime. Housing associations build, and the thinking is that because they're independent organisations for accounting purposes, they can take an element of public grant, complement that with private borrowing, and then that sits off balance sheet. So the idea is the government gets kind of 2 for 1. So for all new build program, that goes through our housing associations, and there's 19 of those in Northern Ireland, and they've got maybe about 60,000 homes under ownership. which has grown quite significantly in the last 20 years. So still quite traditional, I would say.
It's very interesting. It sounds like a very centralized system from what you're describing. And my hunch was correct. It was an Australian accent that was going to come at us and not a Northern Ireland one. So thank you very much for joining us, Justin. And next up is someone I've had the pleasure of knowing for a few years now. Juha Kihila is the head of international affairs for the Y Foundation in Finland. They are the largest social housing operator in the country, and he was the host for our international study tour last September in Helsinki, and a very gracious host at that. And I describe him as the international rock star of housing first. So over to you, Juha. What order of government is in charge, and what roles do they play in Finland, and what is the market share of community housing?
Thank you, Ray, for the kind introduction. Yeah, really nice to hear the rock star once again. No pressure. Well, yeah, I think in Finland, the overall market at the moment, it looks like 70% owns the apartment, around 30% are living in rental apartments, and then 13% out of all the housing is actually state subsidized affordable housing. So 13%. So figuring that in UK and many other countries, it's a much larger scale regarding that, and still Finland is considered to have like the massive stock of affordable housing, and that has been one of the reasons why the number of homeless people have been decreasing in the past years. And then, but yeah, in Finland, of course, government, they have a huge power when it comes to state subsidized housing. They have their own organization called Center for State Subsidized Housing Construction. And this year, I think the budget is around 1.6 billion euros. Next year, it will be less, so around 1.3 billion euros, and it will go down in the next years, to be honest, because the government has decided that, market will take care of the affordable housing side as well. And of course, we all here know that will never happen, unfortunately. But yeah, so of course, government plays a huge role when it comes to this. And of course, then the cities, they have a big role as well. So in Finland, the cities, they have this kind of formal agreement with the government, how they use the land, housing and transport, and how they build the housing and transportation. So they have a formal agreement with the government regarding that. And what that means in reality is, for example, that in Helsinki, whenever there's a new living area coming up, the goal is to have 25% state subsidized affordable housing, no matter where that living area is coming. So it can be very near the city center on a seaside. As Ray knows, he spent a day in the Dude Island in Helsinki, which is a quite new neighborhood. It's a great location, and there is a 21% around this is state subsidized affordable housing. So our goal has always been that we try to build affordable housing everywhere. So we try to avoid the situation where we only build on the outskirts of the cities and create these different kind of challenges for those areas. But in Finland, whenever you're walking around, you wouldn't guess from the outside which one is like state subsidized affordable housing and which one is private housing, because the quality has to be as good from the outside as the inside as well. And then, yeah, but that's in a nutshell situation.
The work that you and your colleagues have done in Helsinki and in almost eliminating chronic homelessness has been an inspiration to the world, but also a little bit disappointing to hear that the new national government is letting things slip by making these cuts. Juha mentioned Dude Island, which is a redevelopment project of former industrial land near the docks and the water in Helsinki. I highly recommend any urban planners in Canada and anywhere else in the world to visit Dude Island if you want to see urban redevelopment done really well. Next up, Veronica. We all have our fingers crossed that the audio troubles have been worked out now. Veronica Ivanevski is here as head of international relations from Vienna in Austria. And for those of us who work in community housing, Vienna is like this mecca of doing things fantastically at an amazing scale and on everybody's bucket list of where to visit. So we're very happy to welcome you to this webinar and to welcome you to the Canadian community housing scene as well. Same two questions for you. So what level of government is in charge of community housing, and what role do they play, and what is the market share of community housing where you're from?
So thank you very much. I hope my audio is better. If it's not clear,
A
Is it
little
better to turn off
garbled.
my camera? Can
It
you hear
didn't
me?
seem it didn't seem to help when you turned your camera off.
Is it? I will try to speak there. Um, but when we try to do things, it just seems not to work properly.
Sorry, Veronica.
Speak.
It's a little garbled and we can't quite make out what you're saying. Hopefully you and Mel can maybe troubleshoot in the background and we'll come back to you on that one. Very sorry. I'm gonna throw a bit of a curveball at our panelists as well, and later on in the conversation, I'm gonna ask you to each prepare a question for one of the other panelists, so we can get some of that conversation going. But I have two questions coming up for each of you now. Is, what's working well in your jurisdiction? What is something that you think is a story that you can tell the rest of the world that they can follow? And then one of the things I'm always interested in when I talk to housers from anywhere, either around the world or in Canada, is what's not working really well. What are the things that maybe seemed like good ideas and aren't working out, or things where you're not making the progress that you had hoped for. So I'm going to mix up the order a little bit, and I'll start with Justin, then Juha, then back to Paul, and then hopefully Veronica will be back with us by then as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. So in terms of what's going well, I think in Northern Ireland we are, there's a lot of political and government support for social housing. There's obviously a whole range of reasons why that's the case, but I think importantly, we have because of the troubles and the peace settlement, there's a mandatory coalition government. So essentially, every party of a certain size are kind of forced together to work in government together. The two largest parties draw, quite a diverse range of voter base across all kind of people from socioeconomic backgrounds. So, very often I'm speaking to MLAs and ministers, they were reared in social housing themselves, they understand the value of it. And to this day, they have people hammering their door, saying, well, why aren't there enough houses being built? So I think that does help to reinforce the value of social housing and how it's considered within government. So I think that's something that is going well. And just by way of an example, we've recently had a new program for government, and following some lobbying work from ourselves and our housing partners, we got a standalone housing priority within that program for government, and it's one of the few areas where there's actually a target within the document. So that's just to show you that there is this kind of strategic importance placed on affordable housing provision. So that's the first thing that's going well. Second thing, I think education as well, because often you talk about housing and you end up talking about skills, about apprenticeships and things like that. So I do think we have had a rough patch here where we had a university degree in housing management, and one of the universities in their infinite wisdom decided to scrap it along with the dance degree to save a bit of money. Never mind the fact that 90% of people coming off that course went straight into housing management, be it housing association, housing executive. So it was jobs on tap in a very rewarding career with great progression and advancement opportunities. So it was crying shame that went. So we stepped in and worked with the sector and the further education sector over here to co-develop new housing apprenticeships. So that's been underway for a few years now, and associations, credit to them, have backed that financially and employed young people. We've recently had a new foundation degree come into play as well. So I do think even though that's been a bit lacking, maybe about 10 years ago, that's starting to come back through the system again. So that's a kind of couple of things that are working well. In terms of a couple of things that aren't going so well, I think like everywhere else, there's a lot of pressure on public funding, which is a challenge for social housing because it's subsidised housing. So the implication is that subsidised housing requires subsidy. And where there's less subsidy, that has implication on what's viable in terms of what we can build, how much we can build, how affordable it's going to be for the people that need homes to be affordable. So there's a lot of calls on resources at the moment. And recently there was an announcement that the average grant rate was going to fall from kind of, I think about 52, 4%, down to the low 40s. So that will have implications in terms of, well, what does that mean for affordability? What does that mean for viability, and so on? Another quick one is social security policy. And I think that's linked to the funding challenge. And that's that this, support for social security for people that need help with housing costs is increasingly austere. So we actually did some research last week that found a thing called local housing allowance, which is like a housing benefit for people who rent privately. That's designed to cover the cheapest 30% of properties in a given area. But successive governments have frozen that to save money. So at the moment in Northern Ireland, it's only covering an average of between kind of 9 to 14% of the cheapest homes. And that's actually lower than in England, where the average is around 20%. So I think resourcing is probably a key challenge for us at the moment.
There might be an emerging theme there, about some of the global political trends where we're seeing governments having to cut back on some of these investments, even where they've shown to be effective in the past. And I appreciate the role of the Chartered Institute of Housing playing, in supporting that sector in education and training. I was in Ireland on a social housing study tour less than 10 years ago before Brexit. We spent some time in Dublin and in the Republic of Ireland, and then went up to Belfast in the north. And there was so much optimism about that border slowly disappearing. But I was surprised when I got to the north that there were still lots of neighborhoods with razor wire and, sectioned off. People were talking about how, until you get to college, you might not meet someone who's of the different faith from you or from that different community. And it seemed like social housing was trying to play a very active role in better integrating communities and in improving those connections and dialogues. And I wonder if that's still the case, and if that's still progressing, even though Brexit must have changed some of the relationship with the Republic of Ireland, of course.
I think, Northern Ireland continues to be a highly segregated society. Housing, I think over 90% of housing estates in Northern Ireland is single identity. And that rises to, I think, 96% or thereabouts for social housing estates in particular. And that's kind of legacy of our social, cultural, political history in terms of, particularly after the Troubles, where people, there was always an element of segregation, but people started to move out of neighbourhoods to join, people of a similar ethnicity and religion because they felt safer in those areas. And that's a massive challenge, because that's a challenge at a societal level. And it's very difficult to break down. But you're right. Housing plays a very powerful role in that. There's a program called Housing for All that's specifically designed to develop shared housing schemes where you get people from different backgrounds living together. There's a brilliant community-based housing association in North Belfast called Newington. And they operate in an area that was one of the harshest flashpoints of the Troubles. And it is a peace line, but if you walk down that road these days, you wouldn't know it. Physically, it's been re-imaged. There are no telltale signs immediately that it is a kind of segregated community. And actually on that peace line is a shared housing scheme. And if you had said to somebody, 40, 50 years ago that would have been the case, you'd have been laughed out of town. And a lot of that is to do with great work on the ground that happens at a slow burn over many decades to change people's hearts and minds. This is the challenge with community cohesion more broadly, that it's not going to work if we as housing professionals go into communities and tell people what they're going to cop. You have to do it with people to change people's attitudes and bring them along with you on the journey. And that's a challenge for ourselves, like I'm sure it is everywhere where there are degrees of kind of social and political division.
Thanks, Justin. Social housing plays a lot of roles in integration, but that's a whole new dimension that you're dealing with in Northern Ireland. So over to you, Juha. What are the things that I know you spend a lot of your time proudly telling the world about the successes of what you're doing, but what are some of the things that are also maybe not working as planned or as hoped?
Yeah, for sure. I think I will approach the team a little bit for the homelessness work, of course, because I think these things go hand in hand. And of course, Finland is quite famous about our housing first model. And of course, that's something that we are very proud to tell the story regarding how the number of homeless people has been declining and how we went all in with the housing first since 2008. But that wouldn't have happened without the affordable housing stock we have, and which we have been building since 1949. And we have never stopped, because there is this saying in Finland that you can't have housing first without actually having the housing first. And I think that's quite true in many cases and in many countries that are now trying to scale up the housing first model and so forth, and always housing seems to be the issue. And then the other thing regarding that, we were just talking about the affordable housing stocks, and like I said, we have 13%. So on a scale, it's quite a bit, but then comparing to Vienna and Netherlands, it's nothing basically, more or less. But what we have made different compared to many other cities and countries is that our housing stock is always targeted for the people who need them. So there is no waiting list per se. So for example, of course, I could apply myself for affordable housing, but I would never get it because I have too high income level. So I think that has made a big difference, that the housing stock is actually going for the people, low-income people, single mothers, ex-prisoners, and so forth. And then I think comparing to Sweden, for example, which is our loving neighbor country, there is no such thing. And then the waiting list to get affordable home in the city of Stockholm, for example, is 20 years, because it's only based when you put the application in, and there are millions of applications, and people sign their children when they are born straight away to the affordable housing list. So I think that's something that we have managed to do quite well. And then of course we have a lot of challenges at the moment, and I was just mentioning that the government that has been in power for the past 2 years, they have this kind of naive ideology that all of the sudden market would take care of the affordable housing as well. It's a right-wing populist government. And of course, it has already done a lot of damage regarding that the number of homeless people, for example, went up last year, first time in 12 years. They would like to reduce the affordable housing stock in the future. They have made some cuts to social benefits. They have made cuts to NGOs working in the field of affordable housing and homelessness. So a lot of challenges and detours in the Finnish perspective as well. And of course, we try to do everything in our power to make them realize, where we are heading if we keep doing like this. And then the next elections are in 18 months. And of course, now the polls are looking quite favorable that there could be a change of government. But nowadays, you don't know what will happen until today and 18 months. And so it might be the same government coalition in power for the next 4 years as well. So, of course, we try to have this kind of good relationship and discuss things further as well. But yeah, a lot of dark clouds in the Finnish field as well. And yeah. Let's see where we are going, but at the moment we need to do a lot of advocacy work, a lot of lobbying here in Finland as well.
We were pretty certain a year ago about which direction our national election in Canada was going to head, and then Donald Trump said a couple of stupid things and it changed course entirely. So you never know in this current climate exactly where things are going. That's such a stubborn idea that some people have, that if we just get out of the way, the market will solve these problems of housing affordability. And if the market could do that, the market would have done that. I think we've learned that lesson.
That is so true. And I think, there are a lot of new young politicians and they don't know the history, because we started to build the state-subsidized affordable housing after the Second World War, when we lost a lot of land to Russia and we needed to house 400,000 people who were left on the wrong side of the border. And that was the starting point of the Finnish state-subsidized affordable housing. And at the beginning, it was actually supposed to be only for a limited time, for 7 years, from 1949 until 1956. But of course, the politicians back then already saw that this is something that we need to keep doing, and we have been doing it since then. But now the new generation of politicians, they seem to think that market is king in each and every field, and market works perfectly. And of course we try to say that unfortunately I have to say that you can see what market has done housing in Canada and what market has done housing in the UK and many other countries where the situation is quite different compared to Finland. So we'll see what happens, but yeah, it's unfortunate.
Thanks, Johan. Veronica, I think we have you back.
Yes, can you hear me better now?
Fantastic. Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Unfortunately, I cannot turn my camera on because this, for some reason, now is not working, and I don't dare to leave the room anymore. So I hope it's fine that at least you can hear me.
Okay, the sound is great. So we'll come back to you and get caught up a little bit. So in
Okay.
Vienna and in Austria, tell us a little bit about the housing system, which orders of government are implicated and what their roles are, and the market share of community housing.
Yes, so in Vienna, the federal government creates the frame in the sense that they're responsible for the legislation in terms of housing and the collection of the housing tax. So in Vienna, or in Austria, I should say, social housing is funded through a portion of the income tax, namely 0.5% of the gross income of employees and employers, so in total 1%. And from this share, the federal states are receiving funding on a yearly basis. And the federal states have a lot of authority when it comes to housing. And Vienna is not just the capital of Austria, but also a federal state, which means that we can influence also our regional legislation when it comes to housing. And so politically, the city councillor for housing oversees the housing policy decisions. And then operationally, we have Wiener Wohnen, the company that I'm working for, which is Europe's largest public housing administration. And we administer the 220,000 apartments that are in the ownership of the city of Vienna. But our system consists of two different segments. So we speak about municipal housing, that is more than 20% of the market share. And then we also have non and limited profit housing, which also constitutes a little over 20% of the market share. So we almost have 50% of the, so about 45% at this moment in time of the entire housing market being affordable housing. And then also a part of the private rental is regulated. That is also set in national legislation, and it depends on the age of the building. And the share of home ownership is actually really low. So we only have 19% of house and apartment owners in Vienna because we do not have the ownership mentality. But I have to say that Vienna is very different from the other federal states. And we were also lucky in the sense that we have had political continuity for 100 years now, except for, of course, the time of World War II. So this idea that housing is not a commodity, but a basic human right has been carried through from one generation to the other until this very day.
It's an interesting theme that I think has emerged here too. You know, these are a lot of you are working in jurisdictions where there is enough of a political consensus that it withstands, changes in government, even, plus or minus when it comes to funding, but the general thrust still remains. Veronica, in Canada, when we read about social housing in Vienna, we're really impressed with the scale of things. But I'm wondering if you could help us peek behind the curtain a little bit and share some of the things that maybe aren't working according to plan or as much as hoped.
Well, we have our challenges, of course. And one big challenge that we have right now is the decarbonization of our housing stock. So we have the goal to fully decarbonize our housing stock by 2040. But 93,000 of our 220,000 municipal apartments are still heated by gas. And so we are looking into different options in terms of performing the switch over. So looking into, of course, solar panels, installing solar panels on the roofs and on the facades, installing heat pumps, switching to district heating. We have a very extensive district heating network that is also run on waste incineration, for example. So we're looking into different options. We also invest a lot into renovation measures. We have a lot of housing complexes that are by now approximately 100 years old. So of course we have to renovate them, and with large scale renovations, we perform them every 40 years. But we receive approximately 10,000 apartments back per year. And when that happens, before they are handed over to the new tenants, we perform renovations on the inside. So that has the effect that when we do large scale renovations, we don't have to relocate the tenants because we can then focus mainly on the facade. So this is one of the challenges. And then, of course, a social challenge would be the fact that we have 500,000 people living in municipal housing. And of course, due to human nature, there is always room for conflict. And so we have a conflict management team in place that reaches out to people if there is conflict, and they try to find the best possible solution for both parties involved. And of course, also, even though Vienna's system is not catered towards the poorest of the population, it is open to broad segments of the population because just like in Finland, we want to have a social mix. We don't want to have segregation, and the housing quality is actually high enough that it is sometimes hard to tell whether it's private housing or municipal housing or subsidized housing. And but of course, we also have a share of people who have at times trouble paying their rent. And so we have a special team in place that also reaches out to these people and tries different measures in order to prevent them from losing their home. And of course, also another challenge is the fact that even though our system existed for 100 years, we have to remain flexible in the face of a constantly changing society and changing needs, because we always have to put the needs of the people at the base on the in the center of our housing projects. So we monitor the changes within society and see what new groups emerge and what their needs are. We have a housing research department that is also responsible for that. And so, for example, we have noticed that we have a rising number of single parents, and this is why the housing sector now tries to build apartments that are specifically meant or catered towards single parents. So we have to constantly evolve, and of course, this is a continuous challenge for our housing system and the people working on it.
Thank you, Veronica. I hope to get to Vienna one day and be able to visit some of the social housing that's there. Would I be correct in my assumption that the average age of the housing stock in Vienna is probably older than any of the other countries represented on this call?
Yes, that might definitely be. I mean, we have begun to build our social housing in the 1920s, because after World War I and before that too, Vienna was Europe's, or we were known as the city with Europe's worst housing situation, in fact. We had lots of homeless people, lots of overcrowding, hygienic conditions were horrible, and especially the workers' classes were very much affected by that. And then everything changed in the 1920s when the Social Democratic Workers' Party took over the administration and implemented a new system that where housing was a pillar of that. It was also about education and health, so the so-called Red Vienna scheme that was implemented back then. And ever since then, of course, we have, as I have mentioned, continued this system.
I'm so glad that you're able to be back on the call and your sound is working out great. So we're going to go over
Yes, I'm
to,
glad
to, to
to.
Paul now. So Paul, and I would love it if you could also comment on Homes England and some of the parallels potentially with Build Canada Homes, or some of the lessons that you've learned with Homes England. But what are the things that are working great in the UK, and what are the things that are not working so well?
Working well. There was something you had touched on, the lobbying that's been going over the last 2 or 3 years with Labour when they weren't in power has started to bring results. So we have seen a significant investment of capital come into the sector. And that's been a huge change. It has really given confidence that we can start to produce social homes at a reasonable rate. Around about 180,000 homes are expected to be produced during the Parliament. So I think that target I mentioned before, that target was really important because we became important to government. Before that, we weren't really. But as soon as they put a target on it, they had to deliver it. Therefore, we came in. We've also seen devolution to mayors in 6 key areas, which is the first time you're seeing power really going down to regional locations, and mayors will play an important role in how funds are delivered in the future. And one other issue around the provision of homes, we also got a rent guarantee, a rent increase guarantee for the next 10 years. That's given organisations certainty of income, so therefore it supports our ability to invest in new homes going forward. So I think the lobbying has helped the capital side. I think what we've seen with our regulation is a drive to improve standards in terms of what residents want, the way services are provided, listening to residents. I think was a point Veronica touched on, just making sure you address their changing needs going forward. There's a lot of work being done there, but also there's been quite a lot of sticks have been brought into bear. The Ombudsman Service is much more aggressive in terms of what it expects to see. The competence standard are coming around housing professionals an expectation that people go through different standards and quality, and a greater oversight expected of boards. And I think we've also seen boards put under much more pressure to make sure they do their job effectively. But I think you're also seeing some good innovation coming around. We've seen new forms of investment, new ways of bringing funding into the sector. We've seen more porous markets with cash moving between both private development and grant programs to allow housing to get produced. And we're seeing AI being used more aggressively in organisations as well, trying to find different ways and means to move things forward. And also just a shout out to the CHRA, because they were part of the lobbying to try and get these changes for government with the National Housing Federation. So some really strong approaches. In terms of the not so good, the biggest issue I think for the sector is the quality of stock here. A lot of the stock isn't the standard it should be. It's taken a huge investment from organisations, and because new regulations have been established, quite draconian ones, organisations are channeling a lot of investment into existing assets, which means that available funds for new build is less at a time when we need to actually step up and deliver. We've also seen, I think, homelessness increase, wait list increase, so the demand is not going away. We've also got behind that political issues around welfare and immigration. So there's an interesting mix going on in the country about different pressures, different demands. And for organisations, pressure on capacity to be able to provide homes, competing priorities are only increasing. Planning in the UK is glacial in terms of getting things done. It's really difficult to try and move things at speed. Regulation is constantly changing and evolving, and organisations need to keep up with it. And risk is always a challenge, and there's increasing risk in a whole range of areas for organisation. And the market itself changes frequently. So whilst there's opportunity, and there's certainly an opportunity to improve, a lot of challenges need to be managed, and organisations do need to manage these well, because the risks are clear. And if the regulator thinks organisations are not doing their job effectively, they will start to take an interest in what you do and how you do it. In terms of Homes England, So in terms of Homes England, Homes England has been around in several iterations over the years, from the Housing Corporation to the HCA and others. What we've seen is a progressive extension of powers. So therefore, it is very much about a partnership power, bringing the private sector, bringing government, and bringing the social sector together to create partnerships, to create guarantees. In one instance now, we're talking about a national housing bank to help subsidise organisations get involved, to support SMEs getting up and running, and to be able to build and invest in homes. So it's a very broad approach, and the underlying current is one of collaboration, cooperation, and partnership. I think if we get those right, there's a real potential to make things different for the future. And I do get the impression that Build Canada Homes has got similar principles, not quite as far reaching, but then again, Homes England has taken probably 30 years to get to where it is now. You're at the start of the journey, so your evolution is yet to come, but I think it's a good platform to build from.
To the start of the journey. In fact, the government just released a investment policy framework for Build Canada Homes on Saturday, which is National Housing Day, and it is still very much under development and in its emerging phase. And so, thank you very much for providing that perspective, Paul. I'm gonna open up to the audience with questions and answers soon, and invite our colleague Mel to come back to moderate those. Before we do that, we're gonna ask the panelists if they have questions for each other. But I wanted to sort of comment on some of the trends that I hear coming out from this conversation. So one is, the important role around competencies and trainings that the Chartered Institute of Housing plays in the UK particularly, and here in Canada as well. The importance of setting targets to focus, and having a government that is supportive to the work that you're doing. That the market can't do it alone, the market can't get it done, but the non-market sector with government support can do the job. And of course, the importance of maintaining and renewing the housing stock. It's not just about new builds. It's about making sure that the housing we've already got is fit for purpose, suitable, and providing good homes for folks. So I'm going to throw it back out to the panel first to ask if you have any questions for each other. And then I see Mel already has some of our first audience questions lined up after that. Who'd like to go first? Go ahead, Juha.
Thank you, Ray. Veronica, I have always been so impressed about the model in Austria and especially in Vienna, but I have always had this question in my mind, and now I finally have opportunity to ask this question. And I don't know if this on your field or a little bit outside of your comfort zone, but regarding the number of homeless people in the city of Vienna, it's around 10, 11,000 homeless people. And regarding that over 50% is affordable housing or social housing, what seems to be the issue here regarding that it's a quite high number of homeless people in the city of Vienna regarding that the affordable housing stock is so big?
So what we see in Vienna is that people from other federal states come to Vienna because we have the best security system. And also people from other countries come to Vienna, for example, from Hungary. And then these people are living on the street or on the street. I mean, we have, like I said, a good security system. So we have night shelters, even though we are trying now to move away from night shelters and more towards the direction of housing first. Um, and the thing is that in order to enter the affordable housing segment, one has to have lived in Vienna for 2 years. We used to have the regulation where one had to have lived in Vienna for 2 years at the exact same address without moving, which was, of course, problematic for people who, for whatever reason, were forced to leave their home before those 2 years ended. And so we have abandoned this regulation. And now the predisposition is that somebody lived in Vienna for 2 years, also in order not to overcrowd the system. But of course, then people who newly arrive, let's say people who are coming from the other federal states as well, would have to first have lived in Vienna for 2 years. But so this is, and in general, homelessness is not within our competency. We have the so-called Fonds Soziales Wien, the Vienna Social Fund, who is responsible for these issues. And like I have mentioned, we have a good support system also within the city. But of course, we also have, as any other major city, homeless people.
Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
Just interested in the point I think Veronica made about housing as a human right. That's something which we talked about in England, but it never seems to be captured as such. I'm just interested in how that cultural shift evolved for it to be seen as a human right, whether that caused you good or bad concerns in the housing market, Veronica?
Well, yes,
go
excuse
ahead.
me.
Go ahead, Veronica.
So the notion of housing as a human right first came up, as I had mentioned, in the 1920s. And it was, I think back then also, it was clear that the benefit that not only the people living in those affordable, high quality apartments would collect the benefit of the system, but also society at large. Because today, also looking at how Vienna is today, because of the high share of affordable homes that we have, we exert a price dampening effect on the prices of the private rental market. So in comparison to other metropolises, we still have lower rents also on the private market. Of course, they can be really high as well because of location surcharges. But in general, in comparison, we're still doing okay. And also because social housing is not, and has from the beginning and not been seen as housing for the poorest populations, and segregation was not taking place, in the sense that even the first social housing complexes were built within the city. There was originally the idea to build them on the outskirts, but the city has also historically been in the possession of plots within the city, and then the decision was made to build them in the city, not to push these people away. And this is something that we are implementing to this very day, which is also why we don't have dangerous neighborhoods in Vienna or no-go zones. And the fact that people are not housing cost overburdened also leads to a situation in which they can spend more on other goods. So it is also beneficial to the economy as such. And also the housing system provides and secures thousands of jobs in construction, for example, and administration. So from the beginning, it was clear that housing has to be seen as part of larger strategies. It cannot be seen separate from everything else that is happening in the city, because it very directly influences life in the city and also the living quality.
Thank you.
This follows a good question and a great answer, Branka. We'll go to Justin, and then I'm going to hand off to Mel, who's going to moderate some questions from our audience.
Yeah, so I have a question for you, Ha. You mentioned that there'd been a rise in populism in Finland, and again, appreciate this might be outside of your areas of approach, but just interested in your take on that. You know, what's driving that? And I ask it because I mean, you touched on it before, Ray, that we neighbour with the Republic of Ireland, so we have kind of two nation states on the one island. And sort of my perception of the Irish Republic is that it always kind of had a tendency to be quite benign in its approaches to things, whereas even there we're seeing, you know, lately this kind of rise in populist movements that sort of undermine social fabrics and stuff. So I'm just interested in hearing what's happening in Finland.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think we are just, you know, unfortunately adapting some of the waves that are coming from the US and from the UK with the Nigel Farage and of course Donald Trump back in the days, and now back at it. So I think our populist parties are adapting those playbooks, to be honest, and you know, more lies and you know, being a homeless, it's your individual's own fault, not a failure of a society and so forth, and blaming the people who are unemployed and everything between. And I think they have the exact same playbook. So of course now what is happening in the US where the Trump is building these huge homeless complexes. I think in Utah there is the first one at the moment. So of course we are waiting when the wave comes to Europe, and then when the populist parties in Finland start to pick onto those ideas that maybe we should do something similar. So I think, to be honest, that they are just copying the playbooks of the bigger populist parties around Europe and North America, to be honest, unfortunately. And then some people are falling for it, and that's the scariest part, in my opinion, that there are quite many people who fall into those lies and arguments.
Thanks so much, Juha. We have just a couple minutes for some questions from the audience before we leave, so apologies about that, but hopefully we can get some of these answered and then maybe facilitate some questions later. So I'm going to turn over to Steve Pomeroy. Steve, just remind, if you can try to keep it condensed, that'd be great. And then we'll turn it over to David after that.
Thanks, Mel, and hi, Paul. We go back a long ways.
Hi, Steve.
Just a quick question. You mentioned that the target 180 homes in England during Parliament, and if you could just clarify what is that term? Is that 4 years, over 5 years? What's the duration? And secondly, and you also mentioned a rent guarantee, which I presume is facilitated by housing benefits. What level of actual market rent would that guarantee kind of get a provider to in terms of the viability of the project? And I guess sort of to segue that over to Justin as well, who had mentioned capital grants are going down a bit. Do you also have housing benefit in Ireland, and are you able to add together the leverage effect of housing benefit with that grant?
In terms of the first part of your question, the commitment is quite clear to social and affordable homes support the government's commitment to delivering 1.5 million homes in this Parliament, 5 years. So that's the intention, of which 60%, hence 180,000, will be social housing. So it's a very ambitious target, I think, is the best way to describe it. The rent increase is more about giving organisations certainty to take out long-term borrowing. So CPI +1 will be what organisations can achieve going forward. So that would be around about 4.3, 4.5% increase. What organisations need when they go looking for funding is to be able to understand their long-term cost. So organisations like the idea that we know the rental income that we're going to receive over the long term. That allows them to get reasonable deals and allow for 30-year funding structures most housing associations have.
Looks like Paul's frozen there. Maybe jump over to Justin.
Yeah.
Each organisations doing the job.
I think we just lost you there for a second, Paul.
Oh, sorry. I'm just saying that the CPI +1 is really helpful in terms of giving you long-term funding structures.
Yeah, so just on your question, Steve, about social security. So yeah, social security is an area that isn't devolved. So that applies UK-wide. So you're right that does play a role in terms of housing affordability. Because I think in Northern Ireland, the percentage is actually higher than it is across the water, where I think off the top of my head, something like 70% of people who live in social housing have full housing benefit entitlement. And then there's another kind of 10% that have partial benefit entitlement, which just basically is to say that their rent is covered in full through the housing benefit system, which is very helpful in terms of retaining affordability. But yeah, it is a challenge then, because when I mentioned the housing executive earlier, who have 83,000 homes, because they're a public corporation, they're not allowed to borrow, or more strictly, if they were allowed to borrow, it would just be on the public balance sheet. And then on top of that, their rents are not set through a social housing rent setting policy. It's set through ministerial diktat that happens on an annual basis. So they've got this massive stock that's a lot older than housing association stock. It's also stuff that was built sort of post-World War II period. So stuff really in need of investment. But yet the housing executive don't have control of their own kind of rental policy, in a sense of, being able to predict on a year-on-year basis what it's going to be in the longer term to enable them to invest. And then to make matters worse, any time that they want to raise it, they then have this argy-bargy with the UK government, because of course, if they hike the rent, then because of the high permeation of housing benefit, Treasury is then concerned that that's going to lead to, more and more social security expenditure. So it does provide reassurance, but also challenges as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. My point in asking is simply just to make the difference with Canada. We tend to focus more on the financing side and the capital grant side without thinking about the revenue side, which is why it's an Achilles heel, I think, in our ability to actually grow our stock. So thanks for the answers.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Thank you all for those responses. David, I'm so sorry. I know you had a great question about more discussion on housing as a human right, but we have ran out of time here. I appreciate that people from BC have joined at 8 a.m. their time, and you have, for example, joined at 6 p.m. his time, 7 p.m. his time. So we are going to have to wrap it up. I'm going to turn it over to Ray for some closing remarks, but thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Mel, for all of your work at CIH Canada and for CHRA, but for putting this panel together as well. And thank you very much to all of the panelists for joining us sometime in the evening where each of you are. National Housing Day was first declared in Canada about 25 years ago, when housing and homelessness was declared a national disaster. And here we are 25 years later, still widely acknowledged to be in crisis mode when it comes to housing and homelessness. But we know how to get out of this by learning from each other within Canada, by learning from our colleagues around the world, and by working together to scale up the community housing sector. So thank you all for being a part of this today. Thanks for joining us, and thanks again to the panelists.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, and have a good
Thanks,
day,
everyone.
evening, or morning.